Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the Southwest Climate Podcast. My name is Gigi Owen, and I've taken over this episode to bring you three special guests. They were all part of the CLIMAS Environment and Society Fellowship Program in 2022. And so a lot of the science that CLIMAS researchers do is done collaboratively with and for our community partners, so that the science that we do is useful to decision-making, policy development, and planning efforts. So the fellowship program offers University of Arizona graduate students the opportunity to do collaborative research to address environmental and societal problems. So our fellows are here today to share more about the interesting work they have done in and with community partners around the world. So without further ado, let's meet our guests. First up, we have Julia Davies, or should I say Dr. Julia Davies. She's a recent PhD graduate from the School of Geography, Development, and the Environment at the University of Arizona. Her doctoral research focused on how low-income urban households in Zambia maintain food security amid persistent social and environmental challenges. During her fellowship, she worked with government agencies and members of the public in Zambia to stimulate dialogue about food security issues that could help push for policy change. So, Julia, welcome. Tell us a little bit more about this work and what brought you to it.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be here. I was saying just before we started that it feels like a while ago now that my PhD work was done, and it's nice to be called doctor. But yeah, as you mentioned already, my PhD work was around urban food systems and urban food security in Zambia and Southern Africa more generally. And that started in 2019 when I came to the University of Arizona from South Africa, where I'm from. Before I came here, I was working more in the climate change adaptation space, so food security and food systems was a new kind of domain for me, but it's been a really interesting journey. And it all started in 2019 when I went to Zambia for 3 months and spent some time in the field, where I interviewed various government representatives, like people in the urban planning department, council people, basically people who are responsible for policy and planning in secondary urban spaces in Zambia. I also contributed or participated in an extensive household survey where together with some of my colleagues, we went around from house to house with the help of several enumerators, and we managed to get around 3,000 household surveys that essentially helped us to understand what the food security status of these households is and what some of the challenges are that households face when it comes to accessing food. We also went to open-air markets, which are traditional marketplaces in African cities and rural areas as well, but of course my research is focused in cities, to understand what types of food are flowing through these markets, who's buying food at these markets, what the prices are, and what kinds of shocks and challenges these market vendors and customers experience. So all of this was aimed at understanding the food system. And if you're not familiar with what a food system is, it's essentially everything from food production through to food consumption and waste management. And I was mostly focused on kind of the middle aspect of that, which is the food retail space in cities. Some of my research also looked at urban agriculture, which is growing food in cities, and for example, in backyards or on roadsides and any of these spaces. So yeah, trying to understand these food systems and what people are eating, where they're buying their food, and what challenges they're facing, and then overarching all of that, how are these food systems governed?
Super interesting, and that's so much work. 3,000 surveys is incredible. Where is it at right now, and what are some of the kind of outputs that you're hoping to produce from this?
Yeah, so I finished my PhD in January. That's when I defended. So most of the work is done, but my first kind of two big outputs from that were two papers. The first was on the barriers to urban agriculture in secondary cities in Zambia and Kenya. I didn't mention this earlier, but some of our data also came from Kenya, where colleagues of mine were doing data collection parallel to my own data collection efforts in Zambia. So I used some data from Kenya as well. And for that component of the dissertation research, we were trying to understand what challenges people are facing when it comes to growing their own food. And this kind of stemmed out of the fact that many of the policy and development actors are pushing urban agriculture as a solution to food insecurity in cities. They're saying, well, people don't have enough food, so they should just grow their own food. But the reality is that, people don't have the space, the resources, the productive inputs like seeds and tools that they may need. They don't have, easy access to water. They don't have the time. There's these various challenges that people are facing that make it very difficult for them to just go and, grow food in their backyard. And among those who are doing that, it's only substituting what they're purchasing from supermarkets or open-air markets. So it's not a solution to food insecurity. So that was the first paper. The second paper was focused on traditional open-air markets. And in particular, I was looking at how these markets are governed. So markets in Zambian cities and in many other cities in Africa have what we call market committees. And these are made up of vendors within the market who are responsible for the day-to-day operations of the market, as well as serving as a connecting body between vendors, customers, and at the other end, the government actors. So we did various interviews and focus groups with these market committees to understand, what does the governance of these markets look like, and how do different styles of governance produce different kind of outcomes in terms of how the market is run and if it's, a sustainable market. The third component of my dissertation, which is still in draft form, and which I hope to publish at some point this year, is actually a review paper that also looks at food markets, but not just traditional open-air markets in Africa, but all different types of markets around the world, from farmers' markets to wet markets to, Middle Eastern bazaars, various markets that are critical for supplying food to urban consumers, and trying to understand what role they play in different geographic contexts. Again, what challenges are faced in these markets, particularly from a governance perspective, and what we can learn from different markets in relation to food security. One thing I failed to mention earlier, which is an important part of my dissertation and also this fellowship as well, is that much of this work took place in the broader context of climate and environmental change. So my own research forms part of a bigger project where colleagues of mine that I've been working collaboratively with are looking at rural to urban linkages around food security in Africa. Of course, I mentioned the third paper is not just focused on Africa, but in general, my dissertation is Africa-focused. And we were looking at various drivers such as, rural to urban migration or, how does climate change and, things like drought affect agricultural production, and then what are the knock-on effects of that for food security in cities. And one of the major things is that drought, causes poor agricultural yields, and that means higher food prices in cities, which then affects urban consumers.
Thank you. I look forward to diving more into some of the details as we further our discussion. Our next guest is Jake Dean, who's a soon-to-be master's graduate from the Center of Latin American Studies. Jake conducted his research in communities along the shores of Laguna San Ignacio in Baja California Sur in Mexico. Here, members of an ejido, or an area of communal land, have faced multiple attempts by outside corporations to purchase their land to mine salt. A lagoon near this land is also a conservation area for gray whales and a hotspot for ecotourism. So Jake, you worked with various community partners to better understand the complex landscape of these competing interests of fishermen, local ejido leaders, conservationists, and then also the whales themselves. So can you tell us a little bit more about what you learned during your fieldwork?
Yeah. So most of my research here at the U of A, and I guess moving forward in my academic career, is really kind of putting a critical lens towards the kind of tenets of green capitalism and conservation as a development, and this idea that, we can use kind of these market-based capitalist approaches to conservation issues in order to provide both benefit for local communities while at the same time providing, for conservation outcomes. And so in the lagoon, I've found that ecotourism and conservation as development has generally led to some of the same types of inequities that we kind of see in other spaces of conservation as development and kind of these green capitalist endeavors. Specifically, inequality first in the fact that while this large ecotourism, this large kind of conservation industry has been built in the lagoon, very few people actually get access to it, right? So it's a few wealthy landowners in the area. It's American and Canadian companies and American NGOs that are mostly gaining the benefit for conservation actions, whether that's for the Pacific gray whale or the local mangrove populations. But it also leads to inequality in a much different sense in terms of who has local political agency to control their resources and the ways in which those resources are managed, right? So if you don't have access to land, or you don't have access to these conservation spaces, or you don't have access to kind of even enter these political spaces, these rooms where decisions are being made about conservation. And finally, if you don't have access to talk to the NGOs who are funding these projects, well, then a number of people in the communities around Laguna San Ignacio felt like they had very little say. And so they didn't feel like they were gaining access to either the fruits of this development project, and they didn't have a say in how conservation was being enacted within their community. And then finally, I guess I'd say the last kind of form of inequality is also an inequity in where conservation dollars and the conservation focus is going, right? As much as I think Pacific gray whales are beautiful animals and should be conserved, I don't think that approaching conservation in an area through kind of the lens of one migratory species is a really highly effective way of including kind of the full socio-ecological community. There are a number of really critical endemic species within the lagoon, and by kind of placing so much onerous emphasis on just the Pacific gray whale or just mangrove conservation, we're kind of losing the bigger picture that conservation requires not just kind of the input and consideration of all local community members who are humans, but also all local community members, whether they be animal, plant, or otherwise. And so I think really moving forward with my project, what I want to continue to kind of interrogate and investigate is the ways in which the conservation movement and kind of this idea that we can do tourism in a sustainable, eco-friendly way to continue to interrogate kind of the fundamental claims of both of those ideologies or movements. And so extending my research, hopefully, to other locations in Baja and up the Pacific coast, kind of following the Pacific gray whale along the path of their migration.
Interesting. And so what kinds of outputs and things are you working on to kind of take some of that research and bring it back to the community?
Yeah, so obviously, I finished the master's thesis and I have some journal articles in the works, but that doesn't necessarily have the most tangible impact within the local community. So I've kind of set about, I would say, pretty much three main avenues of engagement with kind of my local partners, especially my local partners developed through the fellowship. The first, in kind of a weird way, doesn't necessarily have a ton to do directly with whale conservation, but what it does do is working with a group of local women who are trying to build a public green space within their community. And I think this gets back to the idea that, people should feel like they have the agency and some ability to control the ways in which kind of the resources and land in their kind of city and community is managed. So I've used financial support that I've gotten from other sources and part of my money from the CLIMAS Fellowship to literally provide financial support to pour the cement, to buy the rebar that is necessary to kind of build up these public planters and public spaces in this park that they're working on. Second is direct engagement with the conservation groups themselves. I think, like I said earlier, the biggest problem is that these conservation groups come into a community, they meet with the people who are the local political leaders and maybe the largest landowners, and they pretty much don't meet with anybody else. they stay pretty secluded to the beautiful ecotourism camps that, have tons of amenities and resources, instead of talking to, the hundreds of others of, local residents. And so I'm working directly with some of my contacts in these conservation groups to actually try and foster a conversation where other members of the community can at least allow their voices and concerns and kind of future hopes to be heard. And then I hope, as I kind of continue to work in this space, and it's a little hard in kind of the confines of a 2-year master's, but to start building up more resources to also kind of support local initiatives, because there are a number of local initiatives, whether, one person came to me and was talking about their proposal to build a new trash truck and a new method of trash disposal in the area so that there isn't like a gigantic burn pit directly next to this conservation space and this lagoon that, the community is trying to protect. Or a group of local 20-year-olds who have their own plan for how to engage in mangrove reforestation and want to have the agency and control. And so what I'm kind of working towards now and still trying to build up the network is how do we then kind of engage with not just local government actors, but also federal government actors as they, have large amounts of money, they have large amounts of control, especially given that a lot of the area around this ejido, around these local communities, is federally owned, it is federally managed, it is in a biosphere reserve that is controlled at the national level. And so that part of the project is still kind of ongoing, and in my PhD, I hope to become a little bit more engaged and applied there. But, that's part of the process, right? Is developing those skills and developing those connections. So
yeah. It seems like you kind of went in with some questions, and it took a lot of different avenues. So that's really interesting. We'll get more into it as well as we continue. Finally, our third guest is Rachel Zollinger, an artist and PhD candidate in art and visual culture education. Rachel works with a science museum and local community partners in and near Albuquerque, New Mexico, to develop hands-on and experiential art integrated science curriculum for children. So, and as I understand it, a lot of this work really looks at how drawing practices engage children's intellectual and emotional capacities to understand and interact with the natural world. So Rachel, tell us a bit more about this connection that you're building between art and the environment.
So I study children's drawing practices in a science-based environmental learning setting, and like Gigi said, in collaboration with a science museum that I worked for many years. So I'm interested in children's ecological and cultural identities in connection with drawing as a way to learn and to express themselves. So I look at drawing in particular as a mode of learning because it supports both cognitive and imaginative development. And so by that very nature, it's not siloed into one discipline or another. And it's something that humans do quite naturally from a very young age. And most children engage with drawing in often very vivid ways. And so it can be a way to kind of peek at what kind of information they're taking and how they're processing it, and a way of communication. So the education program that I'm studying in particular, which I should say that I helped develop it and I had taught it for years before deciding to pursue my PhD and then study it in a different way. So the way that this program is designed is that it is to encourage children to use drawing to help them make sense of their world and communicate with others. And I'm particularly interested in these children, the research participants who are between ages 5 to about 11 years old, because of the world that they are currently living in, which is very different from the one that I grew up in. Climate change and diminished biodiversity is very real to them, and I think it's a unique thing that previous generations have not had to contend with at such a young age, and so I'm really interested in the ways that they are constructing their identities around that kind of a reality.
That's something that I want to ask all of you, but I'll start with you, Rachel. What's something kind of surprising or unexpected that you've come up against in this work so far? Or not against, but has come up and surprised you?
Yeah. Well, right now I'm really wading through an immense amount of data. I took data over 9 months of these programs, and I am an artist. I have been drawing for as long as I can remember. Drawing is part of my practice, and I have taught drawing to students of all ages for many years, and looking at the ways that children are actually really, truly drawing in these settings has kind of really challenged what I thought I knew about the way that people draw and the way that people are, these children in particular, are taking in information in a way that is often construed as being very visual, and the way that I have taught children to draw is very visual, and realizing that there are so many other aspects that are influencing the ways that they make that graphic representation.
So, like, what's an example?
Well, so traditionally with the way that drawing is taught is very visually based. Like if, so for example, a lot of these things are taking place within a science discourse, which says that you should observe something and you should be objective from it. And these are practices that we are trying to cultivate with children from a very young age. And they really resist that, in that they want their whole bodies to be part of this. They want to touch the things that they are supposed to draw. They want to really put everything into it. They don't see really a difference between where their bodies start and stop, and the body that they are engaging with, whether that's a leaf or an insect or their, fellow classmate.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think. Like, is that something that kind of adults seem to lose over time, or?
Absolutely, yeah. So, like I said, children draw from a very young age. It's a rather instinctual human practice, and about 6 years old, when we start to teach children how to read and write, we really suppress the ability to draw, and it goes from something that humans quite naturally do and are very fluent at, to something that people feel that they don't have the capacity to do that. And so while children very easily communicate in a pictorial sense, the more we encourage them to read and write, they start to lose that or feel less confident with that. And with that, I should say, with that, I think you lose a little bit of that bodily engagement with the world.
Julia, how about you? What was something that kind of stood out to you or surprised you in your research?
Yeah. Gosh, my research is so different to Rachel's. I feel like you can be so creative in yours, whereas mine's more, I don't want to say boring, but but I mean, there have been so many things that have surprised me, and I think it's largely because it's, when I came into the PhD, as I mentioned earlier, it was a totally new kind of field for me. So there's been so many amazing things that I've learned, but a couple of things. If I think about my research on the governance of urban food markets in Zambia, often we'll think, if there's kind of more government oversight and the government's, providing all the services that they're supposed to, like the toilets and, water points where, fresh produce can be washed and, oversees the cleanliness of the markets, these kinds of things, that the market would run better. But what we actually saw in some cases is that informal markets where there aren't very many rules, and not much government oversight, these markets actually sometimes run better. And, there's various reasons for that. And, one of them is that the vendors in the market, are forced to come together and figure out how they can best run this market to obviously make their income, but also serve their local customers. And then also what we see is private sector actors coming in and taking over, what the services that the government should be providing, such as, installing toilets or storage facilities where people can leave their produce or whatever they're selling overnight and not have to lug it all home and then all back in the morning. So in some ways, we could think of these markets as like mini representations of what happens in real life. Because, having grown up in South Africa, we see where there is a lack of services. For example, in South Africa, we have been for many years having an electricity crisis where we have load shedding, which are just rolling blackouts. And now we see independent power producers coming in and, filling that gap in the market. So in some ways, urban food markets are like many representations of that. Another interesting thing is with my research on urban agriculture. You know, when I first went in, I was like, yes, this would be such a good solution. Like, you know, why doesn't everyone just, you know, grow some tomatoes or whatever it might be? And aside from the barriers that I mentioned earlier, such as, you know, people not actually having a backyard to grow things in, or, you know, not having the property rights because they're renting and don't own their place, what we're seeing is that many people actually don't want to do that. They have different aspirations to what we as outsiders might, you know, perceive. Mm-hmm. So increasingly, new generations are actually being born in cities, and they're not, you know, a lot of what the trend in Africa is rural to urban migration, but more and more so, people are being born in cities and they don't necessarily have the desire or the skills to grow their own food because they haven't grown up on a farm and moved to a city, you know. So those are two interesting things that pop to mind.
Yeah, I think, just in my foray into growing food, it's really difficult.
It's so difficult, I know. I'm trying at the moment, and we had one hot afternoon and all my little tomato plants and stuff shriveled up. I'm like, okay, this is hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. How about you, Jake? What's something surprising?
Yeah, I think kind of it's in conversation with both of your answers, like on this idea of, you know, there are these really good sounding solutions, or like in the abstract, you know, a term like conservation, or this idea of, you know, being ecologically sensitive with our tourism. Like, you know, I know as like a angsty teenager, that was something I was like, yes, you know, we need to, like, conservation's what we need. We need to, like, save the whales. We need to, like, engage in these types of practices. But I think going back to something you said about this idea that, like, kind of scientific discourse has kind of built up this one way of looking at something, or kind of what maybe some of these terms mean. And I think the surprising thing is, or one of the hardest things too, I think, with my project, was getting myself out of kind of this techno-scientific definition of what conservation is. And I thought, you know, in my research, there was lots of concerns that local fishermen didn't like conservation. Mm-hmm. Well, they like the idea of conservation. They like this kind of general goal of, like, having a sustainable ecosystem and, like, a livable ecosystem for the future. But the question is, like, what does conservation mean? What does, like, ecotourism or sustainability mean? And so, you know, it became a challenge and kind of surprising of even sitting there trying to, you know, write about this topic and be like, when I say conservation, it's almost now a little bit jumbled in my own head what I'm actually referring to, you know, when I say conservation. And it becomes, I think, really important for a lot of different terms in the environmental space, especially kind of in these areas where, you know, environment and culture are kind of colliding in these really complex ways, is to really interrogate what these terms mean and what these kind of, like, practices that we've all kind of held up on some moral high ground of being a good thing we should be doing. Yes, you know, I think we all can, in the abstract, have this goal that we're working towards, but, like, really clearly and specifically interrogating what those terms mean, and when put into practice, what does that actually look like? And just because, like, we're doing something in the name of conservation doesn't necessarily make it a good action or something that is positively impacting a community or, you know, a local ecosystem. And I think that was really, really surprising, just because, you know, for so many years in my own head, I've been, like, thinking that we need to act sustainably, we need to fight against climate change, but at the same time, I think we have to, like, be a little bit more, I don't know how to frame it, be a little less naive with some of these terms and be a little bit more kind of, like, critically thinking about too, like, whether or not that's the conservation that a local community has in mind, or these are the ecological practice that a local community has in mind. And just because I have a master's degree or I have a degree in biogeosciences doesn't mean I know really any better what, like, the conservation priorities for a local community of people who have lived there for decades really means, right? So it's kind of a tough thing that you kind of have to negotiate and really think about. And still, like, right now I'm thinking about, like, what is conservation, or what should conservation be? So kind of unmooring and undefining these terms.
Yeah, or maybe a broadening of it too.
Yeah.
It's like, it can be multiple things. Well, I think that brings up a really good point that was a similarity across all of your projects, is that they have this collaborative nature, in that you're trying to do work in collaboration with other partners in order to decentralize some of the scientific or like the research or like university role and really, either redistribute some of that kind of like knowledge and power and what that means like amongst your partners, or kind of, build together with your partners some kinds of like newer definitions for things. At least that's my understanding. That's one of my understandings of collaborative research. You might all have different ones. But I guess a question for anyone who wants to jump in. Why was collaborative research important to you? What does it mean to you? How did that kind of come through in some of your work?
Yeah, well, if I can go. For me, I think collaborative research is really important because it makes sure that your research is actually relevant and meaningful to those stakeholders who need to use that knowledge. And in my case, throughout my PhD as well as this fellowship, I've worked quite closely with a couple of people from the Zambia Agriculture Research Institute. And two of them in particular, have been really key stakeholders that have been involved in my research from the start. And one of them, Alan Zollinger, is, he's a really amazing guy. He can pretty much do everything, but he's been key in, helping us access local communities, local government actors, has really been there for us in the field. The other person is with the Zambia, or the National Agriculture Information Services, which is essentially the media branch of Zambia Agriculture Research Institute. So she is quite key in helping us to share our findings and package them in ways that are relevant for government actors who are actually going to have a hand in changing policy or in implementing the kinds of actions that we suggest based on what our findings are. And having had the opportunity to work with these people throughout has just been really amazing. And, I think that it's important to do just because without having that kind of local perspective and that local input, for us coming, from an American institution and, coming into these local communities, we don't really know, what the local context is. So actually collaborating with those local actors and involving them not only in, the latter stages of your research, but having them, help shape what your surveys are, what kinds of questions work well, having them involved in testing our data collection tools has been really, really important. And, through working with them, we've realized that they actually have this amazing capacity, and we've actually brought them on, in co-authoring papers, and helping us develop policy briefs. So yeah, I think collaborating and engaging with local stakeholders is so important to make your findings, as I said earlier, relevant and meaningful and more impactful.
Yeah, and I think going off that, the one thing I agree with entirely is making sure that the questions you're even asking in the first place are relevant to the community you're going to or the community you're working with. I think especially as someone who comes mostly from an anthropology background, there is such a kind of long history of not only kind of a colonial model of engaging in anthropology, but a top-down model of there is one person, they are the expert academic anthropologist, they do the study, come back and tell everybody what they find, and that's that. And I think it's a little bit problematic because even in my own case, I came to the lagoon with a completely different set of questions than the ones I ended up answering or even investigating. I thought there was going to be this big conflict where fishermen told me that, for 4 months out of the year when the whales were there that they couldn't fish. And so that was really cutting into their, fishing income. And then I get there and they're like, well, we just go 20 miles down the coast and it's totally fine. We have this other, fishery we can engage in. And all of a sudden it was well, yeah, okay. I mean, I was basing this question off literature from the 1990s, and the fact that no one's kind of updated the socio-political, socio-ecological situation meant that until I actually worked with the community, engaged with the community to figure out what is kind of the central environmental issue, the central issue with kind of the model of kind of conservation in the current moment, I would have done a thesis that not only would have been not useful for the community, but not useful really in a scholarly context either. And so being able to kind of on the fly a little bit, like have to rethink and reframe and rework your project. Also kind of forces you now to think about this community or this area you've been thinking about and researching and doing all of this literature review on for months before you got there, like in a completely new and different way. And I think adding in those kind of new perspectives is also very helpful to just take your research in a new direction.
Yeah. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah. Yes, I think from the perspective of education, I mean, education is a community effort. Sometimes I think there's a misconception that education is something that happens in a formal school setting, but in fact, we spend so very little of our lives in a classroom, and most of the learning that we do happens outside of that, and that it continues throughout our lives. So that has always been the mission of the museum that I worked for, but also why we work with so many community partners. So for the program that I'm studying has mainly worked with agricultural partners, so small-scale farmers, as well as those committed to making agricultural sustainable, regenerative, something that can happen for the long-term future. Asking them, what kind of things do you want the next generation to know? And so that has ranged from what topics to teach about, to also inspiring the next generation to want to participate in agricultural traditions, but also look to the future for more sustainable agriculture. And so with education, so much of this is intertwined in throughout our lives. It's the way that we come to see the world. And so to do research in education, I think fundamentally necessitates that you engage with the communities where that learning takes place. And those can be, a broad variety. They can be very place-based, but it can also be across discourses as well. And in doing so, I think it makes education so much more meaningful because it connects to the world that you actually live in, and it's not sort of disembodied, without some sort of home in which that you can take it out into the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think all those points are so true and so necessary. I think this kind of work is really necessary to address, all this breadth of different kinds of issues that you all are working on. I guess just as graduate students and trying to do some of this collaborative work, I think, in my experience, there's been sometimes institutional barriers that kind of, make it difficult to really collaborate or to move money or use funding to support their community members or pay them, or there's just all these kinds of little red tape issues that kind of come up from in being at a university. So I'm curious to know what some of your experiences have been around either the challenges or maybe even supports that you've found by doing this work as a graduate student and trying to build these relationships with people as you do this work.
I will say it might be a bit different in my case just because of trying to do fieldwork and community-based and connected fieldwork in a master's that's 2 years long where you have one summer basically. In fact, I had to, during this semester continue on to do more fieldwork just because with how quick-paced it was, I felt like I hadn't done a sufficient enough. I can't do a project on whale watching if I don't go to the field during the time of whale watching, right? And so even trying to build those connections in such a short frame of time was really difficult. And so I think that's one thing I'm excited with and kind of moving into my PhD in kind of a longer format of actually being able to do not just one small short stint of fieldwork, but kind of iterative, longer lasting fieldwork that allows me to build up some of those connections. And so that's something that is not even an institutional problem or a resource problem. That's just kind of the logistics of what master's work is. But I think it is good training and good practice as I kind of continue in the same field site, continue in the same topic, to kind of give me a brief taste of what that experience might be like and for 2 or 3 months instead of what'll be a year and a half in the doctorate. But I think the other thing, and something you mentioned in the question that does make it a little bit difficult, is when you get money from different university sources or different foundation sources, there are very strict reporting guidelines on what you can do with that, and you have to very much match in a lot of cases the budget that you put forth, and you need receipts for the things you're buying. And it does become a little bit more difficult then to alter your plans when you're in the field. And like my field site doesn't really have cell service and internet, and I can't get receipts necessarily for some of the like other things I might want to buy, or kind of change the use of some of my resources to meet the needs or wants or kind of interests that community members and I have raised. And so it does become a little difficult in some of those logistic situations to engage. But I do think that that's one of the real benefits of this fellowship, right, is that the resources are ours to use for, I use part of it to literally pay my rent during the summer when I couldn't find, a job to like support myself. But at the same time, I used part of that on, like I said, the concrete for the public park, and used part of it for transportation. And so there's like a lot more flexibility, I feel like, in this fellowship to use the resources for what we as scholars need, because like we need to continue and survive. And, grad school can be financially tough, but also the flexibility to then in the field on the fly without having to get like tons of prior approval, use those funds in ways that are like very beneficial to our research and very beneficial to the community partners we're working with. And I don't know, in a lot of cases, there isn't that flexibility and freedom, right, with like a grant of multiple thousands of dollars, right?
Yeah, for me, I think one of the biggest challenges was just the distance to my field site. Like it's not a cheap or a short flight to get to Africa. So thank goodness for, technology and the ability to use Zoom and so on to meet with our partners. But, I'm not sure if we were planning on talking about this later, but one of the major challenges I did experience was, of course, COVID-19, and I'm sure all of us did. But I'm very grateful that, I was able to get 3 months of fieldwork in 2019 before the world changed. And then, we were planning on going to the field pretty much every year, but of course that wasn't possible with travel restrictions and so on. So that was a major challenge. But, we luckily, because we had built these connections with people in Zambia after having spent time in that time in the field, that critical time in the field in 2019, we had established those relationships, and building off of that base, we were then able to do phone call surveys and, keep quite a close connection going despite the challenges that COVID brought and our inability to travel because of that. But, related to what you were saying, Jake, around funding, I was lucky enough to come into a very well-funded project where I didn't have to worry about the funds that I needed to actually get my data for my PhD. But again, with that, I was quite confined to what those project objectives were. And, I was very happy with the types of issues that I was researching, but there were some things where I wish I could have had a little bit more freedom. Like, for example, my research on urban agriculture, a lot of that data came out of a household survey, which is great because, you can get large numbers and you can, run some great statistical tests and so on. But we didn't really get at, like, the why behind that. So, like, why are so few houses engaged in any type of urban agriculture? And I would love to have done a more qualitative study to complement that, to actually, speak a little bit more in depth with some of these participants and understand, more about like what the reasons are behind that, and, perhaps like what would need to change in order for them to be able to do that. And then also just to have more opportunity to interview policy actors around, what their take is on some of these barriers. And, it was something that I like, an idea that I put out. It was like, maybe we could do some qualitative interviews. And, partly because of the restrictions of, what my PI and so forth, like, saw as, the most valuable kind of data collection method, but also partly because of the challenges of COVID and not being able to go back to the field. I wasn't ever able to do that more qualitative study. So, moving forward, if I did continue with research, that would be something that I prioritize as a complement to more quantitative types of research.
Did you also feel like any limitations in regards to like IRB and needing like this very strict like ethical and institutional approval before it does also become hard when someone, for example, was in my field site told me like, oh, we should go to this like other community that's a few hours away and we should talk to this person. And it's like, well, technically, I only have field site approval to like be engaging in this one specific community on these specific issues. So like as much as I would love to go do this kind of research, you know, I don't actually know if I have like institutional or ethical approval to actually be doing that. And it does make it a little bit hard too, like outside of funding, outside of whether or not your PI or, you know, logistically you can even do it. It's like also there is in the university system, and I understand why there are these regulations for both funding and for, you know, IRB and ethical concerns, but it does make it a little bit hard to be sometimes as flexible as you want to be with those qualitative methodologies in the field, right?
For sure. I think one thing I learned with IRB is that try and be a little bit more broad, and then even if you don't do all of what you said you were going to do, it's better than like not having approval for something. So for us, like we ended up running our survey in Zambia in 14 different urban locations. And before we went into the field, we weren't actually sure exactly what those were going to be, because a lot of it was kind of, you know, take it as it comes and like, you know, where could we go next? And, you know, or for example, we would get to like a very small urban place and we're like, we can probably get like 10 surveys here. Maybe we use our time better and go to a different town. And I mean, I can't remember how we worded it in the IRB, but I think we made it a little like broader or like more vague somehow so that we weren't tied to certain locations. So maybe that's something you can consider in the future, to just say, you're going to, you know, do various communities in this region or something. I don't know if IRB would, you know, accept that, but yeah.
Yeah, it can be tricky.
Well, I think hearing both of you talk about your experience, I was just thinking how extraordinarily lucky I am to have worked with an organization that I not only knew really well and knew kind of the channels that I could move through, but one that's also very flexible and was very accommodating for the things that I suggested maybe we do, as well as funding, because I didn't have to worry so much about, you know, directly putting money towards something, but there was already channels established, like how to do that in ways that, through the success of that organization, were established as you know, good for the community. But speaking of IRBs, I think, well, I know that a lot of people avoid doing research with children because it's a lot of paperwork. There's so many permissions that you have to do, and people, for good reason, are very reluctant to give permission for their child to be part of research. And so from the very first round of data that I did, I realized how extraordinary lucky I was to be working with an organization that has such deep trust with the community, and that every single parent or guardian consented to allow their child to be in my study, which is kind of unheard of. Mm-hmm. And it meant a lot to me to be, one, a representative of that museum and be part of that community, and to have that trust from day one, and for the community to return and want to support me in the research that I was doing. So, and that experience, I mean, it really solidified my perspective on the importance of you know, really showing up for the community and establishing trust for the long term, which now, Jake, hearing like your story of like, how do you do this in 2 years or even 3 years? I can't imagine any of the work that I have done could have happened in that short amount of time. Like, this is almost a decade in the making for me to be able to do that, which is really special as I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I think one of the basic pieces of the underlying framework of doing this work is those relationships, and you know, like you've come into it in different times. So I think, you know, these relationships for you, Jake, were pretty new, and so you're kind of just at that beginning phase of what could be like a much long. I mean, it sounds like you're going to do your dissertation work around some of these same topics in the same area. So you know, it could become this longer term kind of thing. Yeah, Rachel, you have been building these relationships for a long time, and that kind of allowed you to really come in and do this particular project in this moment. And Julia, I think coming in and having those relationships with your colleagues like really kind of helped enable you to like go deeper into a lot of that work. And so there's, you know, all different kinds of relationships. There's all different ways to come at it. And I think to me that's one of the most interesting pieces of this. And And really one of the best outcomes is building those relationships and building those connections and, seeing how those can help us work together to really, address some of these societal and environmental challenges. So as we wrap up here, what advice would you give to someone who's either looking to do some kind of collaborative research or address some kind of, big environmental or societal challenge?
Well, going off of my experience, I think the very first thing is to really be listening to what the community says that they need and that they want, rather than be saying, I want to do this for you, but actually asking what is important to you and how you can use that as a guiding point for the research that you do. And then secondly, I think it's so important to draw on the existing strengths and assets of the community, because that can only grow. When you're coming from a deficit position, it really no one feels good about it. And so if you're coming from what do we already have and what we can really grow from here, I think you can get a lot further and be a lot more meaningful in what you do.
Yeah, I agree with that, Rachel. And just to add to that, I think I would say, recognizing the capacity that stakeholders have, often coming from, earlier Jake mentioned, I'm doing a master's, or like for me, I'm a PhD, but actually people on the ground have so much more practical knowledge and can, contribute so much more than what we are, reading, in our desk studies or whatever. So recognizing, and embracing the knowledge that they have, and also just recognizing that, many of them do have the capacity to, like I mentioned earlier, co-author or at least, give really great practical insights into the kinds of things that we're writing. And I think that is critical for doing more engaged research.
Yeah, and I think all of that's great advice. The one thing I would also kind of add is being flexible to just kind of ride the wave of what that ends up looking like in your field site. I think a year ago, had you told me that I would have to get into an 8-foot boat and go on 10-foot waves and go net fishing, and that would be very terrifying, and I wouldn't necessarily understand exactly what that would be, teaching me or helping me directly learn about the community. But what was the first thing that everyone pretty much told me in the community is well, you need to go out fishing first, and then you need to you need to do it. We need to see you going out and fishing, and then we'll be more open to talk about it. And once you've kind of gone through that, and obviously as an anthropologist, there was that intention to do participant observation, but just kind of the willingness to, okay, if local community members want you to go see or observe or do this one thing, and then you can kind of collaborate and produce that knowledge, being flexible and open to kind of whatever that is, and whatever kind of direction or research question or topic they kind of want you to move towards. And that's not to say just not to have any of your own kind of intuition or your own kind of academic rigor that you're bringing to it, but just being not necessarily married 100% to one approach, to one question, to kind of one. I keep bringing this up, but kind of unmooring yourself and unmooring your approaches a little bit from just being very traditional and very much what you planned. There does need to be kind of a little bit of that freedom and flexibility, because that's how the knowledge and kind of the expert intuition of these local institutions or local individuals comes through, right? Is you taking away a little bit of your control away and giving it up to somebody else.
Yeah, keeping an open mind and being open to surprises, like we talked about earlier, but also just fieldwork in general. I think you've got to have that flexibility, and things don't always go according to plan. So not being, necessarily super rigid in your approach, but being adaptable, and yeah.
Yes, sage advice. Thank you all so much. It was a pleasure to support your work over the last, really year and a half, and really look forward to seeing what comes next for you all. So thank you.
Thanks, Gigi.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.